Welcome to the Best Hopes podcast. My name is Adam Brower.
I'm Cecil Walker.
And today we're going to go back to an episode that we talked about last season around encouragement. And I think the word encouragement could be just a little bit deceiving. Oftentimes it's connected to things like invigoration or optimism or things like that. But Cecil, I have a question for you, because we talked in that previous episode about something I think that's really, really important, but also something that I think that we should kind of pull apart or enumerate a bit better. And so one of the things that we talked about in that original podcast was how when we're looking at this word encouragement, in essence, it's taking something that is in the future, something that's unknown, and then putting in some work, some effort now in order to be able to achieve that thing that's out there. And so this was one of the very first times where we talked about how hope could be a present-oriented thing rather than a future or like kind of distant-oriented thing. And one of the things that we said, and maybe I'll just read a little bit of this transcript part here, because it kind of highlights something I think important. And it says, words like invigoration and optimism connected to getting to Mars. For lots of history, getting people to Mars seemed unattainable. And now there are several companies and several government agencies who not only believe, but they are pursuing how we are going to get there and what life is going to be like and how we are going to make Mars sustainable for people. I think that believing now that it's possible is changing our technology. We purposely are creating things to deal with high heat, and we're purposely creating things that can last for long distance. The work that we're doing changes because something that seems attainable now seemed unattainable. So the question that I have using that as an example is, how do we hold on to hope about something that seems unattainable that at some future date might become attainable? How do we hold out that kind of hope?
I think, and it's kind of sewn into what you just described in that transcript, which I'm amazed we had those kinds of conversations before, because that sounds really insightful. I think it's almost a requirement. It's not even a to-do about it. It is a requirement that the thing you hope for be a bit of a stretch, or else there isn't really a necessity for the hope in the first place. It's kind of I just see that this is what's coming, right? It's just like, reading the room. And so all the functioning of hope, all of the ways that it leads you to adapt and do all these things that we talk about in all these episodes, it doesn't quite operate in the same kind of a way without that uncertainty or that distance, or that I'm not quite sure that it's all the way out there. Still, though, on the how do we do it, I think a fraction of my response obviously is, I think you just have to. That's a requirement for the hoping. But if you're looking for a how to, it's a bit of letting go of the need to be grounded in the like very concrete, here's what I see. I think people kind of costume it under the guise of like realism, like I can't hope for that thing because it's more realistic not to, or something like that. But I think the truth is, the only way to get the outcome that you want, if it's far-fetched or difficult to attain, is to hope for it, is to kind of let that be a stretch outside of, what seems more realistic. So I think it requires kind of letting go of that and giving in to you could be realistic in saying, I know that maybe this isn't probable, or something along those lines, but letting go of that guise of, I've got to stay grounded in quote reality. I've got to stick to, I think what most people often think of as reality is something more negative, something more, I should assume things will go poorly, or I should block myself from the expectation of good things, of positive things. And somehow that's like a better way of existing, of surviving, of making it through difficult times. letting go of that perspective and allowing yourself to kind of mentally wander onto the idea of things could look different, a better kind of different than they have looked in the past or in the current present situation. And then when that wandering happens, you also kind of leave yourself open to that could mean I do something different with this present moment, whether that's thinking different, feeling different, imagining different, doing different, actions and behaviors that then lead me down that path towards something different. So I think the how to is in the mentally, what are you holding and not holding? What are you open to and not open to? What are you experiencing as is either a mental burden to be available to, or is a mental opportunity, I think, to be available to. Does that
Hmm.
answer that? I was all over the place.
No, that was good. It gave me a couple of thoughts and maybe a couple questions. But I think one of the things that I really liked is that you kind of coined this phrase of like a mental opportunity. I think holding on to that as a mental opportunity is really, really valuable. It You also made a really important distinction between, in some sense, hope. Within hope, there is always uncertainty. If there wasn't uncertainty, it wouldn't be hope. Maybe it would be knowledge. I know this thing is going to happen. I know this is going to transpire. And so embedded in hope is uncertainty, which I think is valuable to remember. But I think one of the things that that brought to my mind is, in some sense, we're putting in current work in attempts really to kind of shift the balance of uncertainty. If I work really hard, if I put forth effort, if I try to create mechanisms to bring this thing about, over time, the uncertainty diminishes and the certainty goes up. And so that was an interesting component of my of thinking for me, because it really puts then squarely in our in into like our own realm. I could influence the outcome of my hope simply by trying to pursue it. So I think there's power in pursuing it, because the balance could shift. I think the other thing that came to my mind is also the mechanism of how to achieve it may become known as I put forth effort. I think if I go back to that original analogy that we started with of like trying to get to Mars,
Mhm.
if we had never gotten to the moon, we wouldn't understand things about like the difference in gravity. We wouldn't understand the importance of like sealing airtight, like maintaining our oxygen level in space. We wouldn't. And so if we hadn't sent telescopes, or if we didn't look through telescopes, if we hadn't sent satellites, we wouldn't be able to gather information and knowledge. So something that seemed really maybe unconnected to our path to getting to Mars, of like, I'm just looking through this magnifying glass at stars, trying to figure out like what are these things. That was a beginning technology component that led to, oh, well, if that's the case, then we could work on this. And so I think sometimes hope is generative, that the step I take this moment leads me to a bit more light or discovery or understanding, which then leads me to the next discovery or understanding. Yeah, we've always talked about how like hope can grow. It can, through positive emotions, then we pursue it more. Through hard work, then we see that there are additional possibilities. But I think with this analogy, it really shows like even our understanding gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So again, we make that transition from unattainable to obtainable, really one step at a time. And if we try to jump too far down the path, we might skip some steps that we actually need in order to understand where we're trying to get.
I think that's totally brilliant because what you're describing there is that, what we've said many times is that it's almost like the specific outcome itself. You wish for $1 million, you wish to be I don't know, the best in the world at your career, at your sport, at your whatever, whatever that specific outcome is, you wish for that. And the process that unfolds on your way toward something desirable ends up being more of the prize itself in the first place. And it starts redefining some of the things that you see yourself stepping on and doing as you make your way toward a particular outcome. And once you're further along, that specific outcome itself doesn't even really matter. It doesn't matter if you get to live on Mars, because you're living in a society where we have satellites and telescopes and all the abundance of technology and knowledge and scientific whatever that just resulted from the stretch of imagining if we're on our way toward Mars. And obviously, it makes it very likely, more and more likely, that you're moving toward Mars. But what's more significant is the way that it totally reconstructs the reality you're in that journey toward if Mars is the outcome. But the other, I think, really amazing thing that you were describing in the first half of what you said, you were saying how like it's maybe hope flips into knowledge once the uncertainty starts to be kind of unveiled, or as you start to move toward that thing and it becomes a bit more certain. And I think what you were describing there is really, really interestingly is like a direct mirroring of what happens in the like scientific method. You know, when someone's doing a some type of science experiment or something like that. And what's really interesting there is you start out not knowing for sure, but you have a bit of a hypothesis. You have some reason to believe here's what could be at play, here's what could be happening, here could be the outcome of this experiment that I run for whatever reasons. And obviously, of course, in a scientific experiment, it's more of a it's more than a hunch than you know, maybe a hope that you have for yourself. There's something that they're pointing to. But I think what's really, really interesting is if you ask a scientist who's running a really hardcore like physics experiment or something like that, the specific language that they use around it isn't that they're trying to find proof of the outcome that they want or proof of the theory that they have. That's not how they would language it. It's they're trying to find evidence against the null hypothesis. They're trying to find evidence against the assumption that nothing is happening. So square one, where they start way in the beginning, is nothing is happening. That's our assumption. There's nothing unique to comment on here. There's no interesting scientific process at play. But then something gives them some idea of, well, maybe something could be at play here. I just noticed that when, you know, an apple gets separated from the branch, it seems to fall. And it falls in all these different kinds of ways. I'm just kind of noticing. And it falls faster and faster. It seems to accelerate if it falls from a higher place. You know, they just start to kind of notice some things that might give them reason to believe something's at play. And that prompts them to say, well, maybe there's something more than nothing. And I need to try to figure out what happens if I act on that, if I poke at that, if I start to proceed in a way that kind of operates with the idea of this is a possibility of you know, this theory, this hypothesis, this whatever scientific process that I'm starting to uncrack is a possibility. And then they run their experiment, and the evidence that they gather, again, isn't evidence for the possibility. It's evidence against the non-possibility. It's evidence that says something more than nothing is there. It's evidence that says, like, I have reason to kind of believe in something else other than nothing at all is happening. And then what they do is either within that experiment or several more experiments, they start to chisel away at it until that possibility starts to become more and more concrete of, I feel like I have more certainty or knowledge of what's happening here. But I just think it's really fascinating how that directly mirrors exactly what you were talking about with hope. All you really need is the seed of an idea of something more than nothing. I could believe in nothing, or I could even believe in worse than nothing, that something is actively working against me. Or I could just believe in the possibility of something more than that. Maybe things could get better. Maybe there's, you know, some idea of I'm on my way toward something actually pretty desirable, something great, something I could be proud of, something I could be really pleased with. And then if I just work with that idea kind of hanging around my head, I might start to find some evidence of here's why that's worth thinking about. Here's why that's a possibility that could morph into a reality, into a this is something for certain or more certain at least. Yeah, I just thought that was really interesting how you described it. It made me think of that exactly.
Yeah, that is a really interesting connection. And one of the things that it makes me wonder, and this, I'm going to take us back again to the original podcast, because one of the things that we're kind of toying with is you don't have to necessarily know the outcome in order to pursue a certain path. But it's interesting because in the original podcast, we said, like, immediately following this whole idea, we said there is a second thought that is important. And the second thing is, we better be really purposeful about what we're hoping for and holding on to, what we dream of. If we're not purposeful, we could end up hoping for something that may not be worth it, or may not be far enough, or a stretch, or may not push us to greatness. So, one of the things that I'm wondering about here is, like, if we're advocating for, you got to be really purposeful about, like, putting your hope into something meaningful, pushing yourself, stretching yourself. But at the same time, we're saying, like, you don't have to know the outcome, or achieving the outcome isn't actually that important. A- On the surface, at least, those seem like contradictory thoughts or ideas. How do you make sense of those two things that might be in conflict with each other?
I think you can be purposeful about the future and how you see yourself now in connection to the future without tightly grasping onto it has to play out in this specific kind of a way. I need it to go in this direction and be this thing. And I need everything that I see to, fabricate into being. Um, it, it, I don't think it has to, that those things are somehow like exclusive. Like for me to have hope means that I'm only ever going to be satisfied with things going exactly the way that I perfectly detailed and envisioned them going. In fact, I think the more expected way is that you become pleased with things you weren't really seeking, things you weren't even expecting to see as you start to move in the direction that you want to move in. Um, and I think that's oftentimes why we've begun to describe these things as being more steep in your identity, who you are as you're moving along the process, rather than the gifts you get, the things you get to have as you move along the process or what you get as a result of the process. It's really who you are as you engage with the process itself. And should you transform into someone different, it really doesn't matter what happens to you. The circumstances might not ever change. People around you or the things around you might not give you the stuff that you want them to give you, but you're different. And so the experience of all that stuff is very, very different. And so I think that's what kind of nullifies that outcome part of it. That nullifies in the sense that it doesn't matter, because I'm sure you might want it for very good reasons, but your relationship to it, I think, changes a bit because your relationship to everything changes a bit. And so the purposefulness is in the choosing to be hopeful, why you're choosing what you're hoping for, and I think really importantly, who you have to be in pursuit of those kinds of hopes. If you lean really into all of those things, you get a looser grip on well, the outcome needs to be, I have $1 million by the time I'm done with this. I got 6 weeks and I need this thing to happen, whatever the thing is that I really want it to happen.
Yeah, one of the things I really like about that is that it, in some sense, it shifts the focus from achieving a particular thing to becoming someone in the process of trying to achieve it. Those words that we used in the original episode were things like, it needs to be a far enough stretch, it should push us to greatness. Putting hope in, by achieving that thing, it's going to stretch me. I'm going to move toward greatness. It opens up the possibility then of change. And I think one of the, like, major components of hope is that something will change. Um, that if I achieve that thing, I I go from not having it to having it. If I strive to get that thing, I become. I wasn't the kind of person who could achieve it, and now I am the person who could achieve it. If I go back to the original analogy that we started with of like getting to Mars, we're a people who seemed that Mars was impossible reach, to now Mars is within our reach. We have changed. Our capacity has changed. And so I think one of the things that's really important about hope is that hope inherently has a change factor in it. And so achieving the goal isn't necessarily the ultimate achievement,
Mm,
but it is the becoming, it's the change that occurs. Um,
exactly.
and so I think that's one of the things that's really valuable too, is that like that when I hear about you have to be really purposeful, then that isn't just like you have to be purposeful about what you pick as the end goal, but you also have to be purposeful along the way to catch the change, to become the change, to adapt, and to say, is Mars still the end goal? Or am I happy with all of this technology that we've got? We've changed our world. Maybe we've, in trying to understand how to live in significant heat on Mars, we developed technology that says, oh, we can control climate change here on our planet. We can start to grow food that is more adaptable to our planet that's warming. Now we don't need to necessarily move to Mars. We just needed the technology that made Earth a more livable place. And I think sometimes if we just get stuck on achieving the goal, we miss all of the changes that occur, and maybe that changes the initial state, and so the goal no longer needs to be that goal. Now that our initial state has changed, maybe we need a different goal or a new goal. I think that's a component of hope that we oftentimes don't think about, is that hope is change is inherent to hope, and therefore our path to it should be adaptable and flexible.
I always think of the like physical exercises is the example that always comes to mind when we talk about this kind of a thing. And I guess we're getting to the end of the year, so a lot of New Year's resolutions are probably going to pop up. And I think all kinds of New Year's resolutions are good examples of this, where people, list out these things they want to accomplish or do in the new year. And it's really not so much about doing those things. You can kind of really feel that it's more about who you have to be in order to do those kinds of things. Maybe that's partially why a lot of people don't usually do the things that are on their New Year's resolution list, which I don't think is that bad of a thing, because again, it's more about who you have to be, the decisions you have to make, all that kind of stuff in doing it. But I say physical exercise is a great example of that, because that's where we can really see the absurdity of the outcome specifics that people set their sights on. These numbers, these goalposts very much don't matter. Who cares that you move this heavy thing this many times? Who cares that, you make yourself tired by running for this amount of time, for this fake distance? You're on a treadmill or you're on the bike or whatever. You're
Hey,
not.
don't make that big distance. That's real distance.
I know you're a treadmill runner, so it's very real to you. But there you can see how like the outcome is very much less tangible than the actual practicality of, like, if you were, manually building a house. So moving those heavy materials are
Mm.
giving you, a usable outcome. Or you run this distance because that's how you get to the place that you're trying to get to, and now you can do the things there that you need to do. Um, and so it there you can really see how it's not about the specific outcome thing that you're doing, because that's not really even that tangible. It's about the process of what's happening as you're doing that. It's very literally about what's changing in your body. Your muscles are being deconstructed to build back up, to be better, to be stronger, to be bigger. You're putting your cardiovascular system under stress so that it can be more endurant, so it can have more stamina and be stronger. Um, that's what's happening as you're doing those things. And so if you set your sight at, I got to lift this much weight, 20 times or something like that, and you find yourself only getting up to 17, but you feel like you gave it every single thing that you had, and you really reached that final wall that you could get to, that's still a win. You didn't get to the 20 or whatever you set your thing at, but you pushed yourself to the point of, I worked really, really hard, and that's going to give me, this gain that I want. That's going to give me this, like, building myself up better in the way that I want. And I made the mental decision of going as far as I could go. I made the tough choice of putting myself in discomfort for the benefit of what I get afterwards. It's very much the process in engaging with, physical exercise, and it's not at all the specifics of what you're really doing. Nothing changes if you run that mile 20 seconds slower than you were really hoping you would run it. I mean that in a like, nothing in a concrete way. I'm not trying to diminish people's people's accomplishments or goals or anything like that, but it's the tangibility of the outcome. There we're able to see how easily we can kind of move around and redefine things. And I think it's the same with any other kinds of outcomes that we might have too.
Yeah, one of the things that I really like about that is, and kind of brings it all the way back to the original, is the synonym that we were talking about at that point was encouragement.
Mm.
And I oftentimes don't think about hope as a form of encouragement, but I think the way that we've been talking about it is like this iterative experience of like, I I do something, and therefore my hope builds a bit. I feel encouraged by that. I feel like, oh, this thing that didn't feel as accomplishable before now feels like I could actually accomplish it. And so taking this small action and using your metaphor of like building up my calves a bit, or building up my endurance, or strengthening my lungs, I feel encouraged by those changes, those small signs. And because of that encouragement, because of those physical changes that occur, then I am more capable the next day than I was the day before. And so thinking about it as like taking these small incremental bites out of something, I'm simultaneously getting encouraged, I'm feeling encouragement, but I'm also, again, kind of shifting that balance from, now it's not just like an empty wish or an idea out there, but it's now belief backed by action that's converted to hope that at some point might become converted to knowledge, right? If I run enough, I become a runner. I can run a marathon, where at the beginning of that process, running a marathon may have seemed unattainable to me, but I take one encouraging step after another, and that encouragement builds and builds and builds, and so then my hope becomes like, I might actually be able to accomplish this thing. And then at some point I do accomplish it, and hope turns into experience or knowledge. But all the while, whether I'm in the place of a thought all the way to knowledge, um, I am I have become something different. I have changed. And so I really like that idea of like that small little encouragement builds up to, this is something really attainable now.
You're right. It really does come back right around to the encouragement that we were talking about. Because if it is a process where you're living in the present moment and the decisions that you're making are all part of the becoming, that feedback loop you get of feeling more encouraged does make a really big difference. And that's, I think, you were talking about this like revealing or unveiling of knowledge earlier, and then the lowering of uncertainty and the movement into things being more certain. I think that's part of that, right? It's obviously this balancing thing that happens where it moves from one side to the other. And I think that encouragement is a huge part of that.
Yeah, beautiful. Anything else that you want to make sure that we add or get to before we wrap it up?
No, I think that was a great one. I learned something every time.
Me too. Which I think is exactly the point we're making, right? Is like, we didn't know all this about hope before we started taking one step at a time into thinking about hope.
Mhm.
And so I think you're exactly right. Well, hopefully that was a useful conversation for all of you. If you know somebody who's in the midst of a journey, If you know somebody who's in the midst of trying to hold on to hope, perhaps sharing this podcast about encouragement would be useful for them. We would really appreciate it. We would also love to hear about the next step you decide to take. So feel free to share that with us too. But go be encouraged by hope.